We're good? All right, cool. All right, so let's get started. We're just about 3 minutes late, so I hope it's not going to cut into the end of this deck. This is the first time I've talked about this kind of formally in pretty much forever, so I don't really have any kind of pacing set up for this one, so I don't know how long it's going to go. So we'll just go right into it. So my name is Martin Roesch. I'm the CTO and founder of Sourcefire, which many people who are out there who know me better as the guy who wrote Snort originally. And so today I'm going to tell you how to make mad loot with open source. So right up front, I'd just like to apologize to the guys at despair.com. Since we're doing a business presentation, I figured their demotivators were only too appropriate. So hopefully they're not going to see this on the internet and sue me. So that said, let's get right into it. So this talk is kind of about how Sourcefire started and open source's role there and what open source is and does for us at Sourcefire. And a lot of it kind of talks about me and my motivations. So I hope I'm not going to come off as pretentious as I do this. This talk is not meant to be about me or my motivations. But that said, let's talk a little bit about me for a second. So I always find it really interesting to find out kind of the backgrounds of people and where they came from when you're finding out, you know people out there in the industry who are who have done things or who are responsible for things that have kind of weighty meaning associated with them. So for example, my CEO of my existing of Sourcefire is a guy who in his previous job was responsible for about $1.5 billion in revenue a year. And we've talked, obviously we spent a good deal amount of time talking, and his dad was a barber and his mom was a nurse. Well, everybody comes from someplace, and I always think it's kind of interesting. My dad was a high school teacher and my mom was a nurse. And I held a variety, coming up where I came from, I held a variety of crappy jobs before I got into engineering. My first real job was weeding onion fields, which I did for about 2 weeks and then decided that McDonald's would be a better place to work. So I was a cook at McDonald's for a while. I got my start in computers as a computer store technician in retail when I was in high school. Eventually I got my engineering degree, got into security in 1996, and in 1998 I started writing a little project that I called Snort. So Snort is kind of an interesting animal. Snort's an open source project, and it's kind of fascinating now with what Sourcefire's done and what we've accomplished in having Snort as kind of this open source core, how much mystery there is around the open source concept and the projects and how you do them and how they work and stuff like that. If you talk to people who aren't close to it, who don't use the technology, who aren't engineers or coders or IT guys and stuff like that, this stuff is like, it's a miracle. Software just appears. Nobody charges me money for it. Is this stealing? Is this okay? The basic idea of open source is pretty simple. You get an idea, you develop in the open, right? You do a public CVS server, you get out there and post up a website, you talk with your community, and then you crank out releases. You actually write software and release it. And it doesn't have to be feature complete. It doesn't have to even be ready for prime time. It can be the roughest idea of what you've got in mind. And if you do it right, if you communicate with your community, the thing will start picking up momentum. And that's what happened with Snort. So Snort is the world's most popular network intrusion detection and prevention system. I originally started writing Snort in a spare bedroom in my house in 1998. In the first year that I was working on Snort, I did 20 releases. So about every 2 weeks, I was doing a Snort release and gaining community around the project. And I wasn't doing anything special. I would come home at night from my day job. I was working for a defense contractor. I would sit down on my computer after my wife went to bed, and I'd write code for a while and answer email for a while. And answering email is actually kind of the other side of the coin with open source projects. You've got to write code and release it and get it out there and get people using it, but you've also got to interact with your community. I wrote about that I know of that I've been able to kind of establish metrics around. I'm sure there's a lot of lost data here. Well over 3,000 emails between mid-1999 and 2002 on the Snort mailing lists. That's a lot of email, right? That's a lot of typing. And this wasn't, just, thanks, I'll get back to you, that kind of stuff. This was technical detail, how the system works, ideas I've got, solving bugs, solving problems for people, telling them how to use it, telling them how to hook up MySQL to Snort, all that kind of stuff. So it was a major effort. At the point that I started Sourcefire, I kind of figured I was already working 40 hours a week on Snort anyway. I may as well make some money on it. And then the other part, develop in the open. Put your source code out there. So before there was Sourcefire, there was another company. And I worked for this company from late 99 to early 2000. I'm wearing their shirt there. This is a picture of me with much darker hair and a much better attitude, probably. It was really interesting. This was a Bay Area company out in California. They had really good people. They had really interesting ideas. And the atmosphere was cool. I don't know how many of you have worked for a startup, but once you've worked for a startup, if you come from a large environment, there's really no going back. If it hooks you, it's great because everybody's there. We're all pulling on the oars the same direction. We've all got the same goal, right? Mad loot. Everybody gets rich. Everybody gets famous. eBay buys us. Google buys us. Somebody buys us, or we IPO. And everybody gets rich. And that happens in a vanishingly small percentage of the cases of these companies, but it is a possibility. And I really got hooked by this. So I was into this, but there was a problem. At this particular company, we had kind of a fundamental problem with the company. And the problem with this company, which turned out to be very disappointing, was that the founder of that company was not very much fun to work with. And I'll kind of leave things at that. But eventually the company kind of evaporated out from under the person who was leading the charge there. So that was very disappointing, and this was in late 2000. So at this point, I kind of was thinking about, what am I going to do next? Should I go get a job? As the guy who had written Snort, getting job offers wasn't a hard thing to do, right? In the security industry, it wasn't hard to come by. People who had problems with packets that they wanted to solve, people who had, who saw I was capable of executing on developing large code bases and communicating effectively with people, and what I like to be a project lead or a lead architect or something like that. So Snort kind of set me up and established me so that getting a job in the industry wasn't too hard. But I had a bunch of people who were saying, hey, you should really start a company around Snort. There's a lot of people out there who are using this. Why not start a company around it? So I would usually respond with something like, okay, great. So how am I going to get people to pay for something that's free? This is kind of a, this is a fundamental business problem. You have free soap. How are you going to get them to pay for the same soap, but now it costs money when they can get it for free and it's lying in, on the street, or they can get it anywhere, pick it up anywhere they want to. And also, what business model should I get into, right? We could do a services company around this. This was the classic open source model back in 2000, 2001. Do kind of a Red Hat thing where you establish services around your open source technology, and you keep moving the technology forward and keep delivering services around it. Well, I'm not that kind of guy. I don't really know a whole lot about services. I like building products. The thing that really turns my dial is having people use stuff that I've created. So I wanted to do a product company, and this was fraught with difficulty because nobody was doing open source product companies. Nobody was trying to solve this problem, or at least all the attempts at that point hadn't gone very well. But I had a little bit of experience with my previous startup that gave me some kind of guidelines for how to get going with this company, right? And it's simple stuff. It sounds simple, but it's actually hard to execute on, right? Hire good people. How hard is that? Well, it's really hard, especially people you want to work with every day, 80 hours a week, because that's what you're going to be doing in the early days of your company. Don't be a dick. This is a big problem we had in my previous company. The guy who was in my role there, not fun to work with. And then total failure can be pushed off for a long time. This is something that I learned early on. I saw companies that other people that I knew were doing, and they were only moderately successful, but they kept plugging away. They kept going. It's actually pretty hard to kill a company. Maybe not today, especially with venture-backed companies and things like that. But back then, it seemed like it was you could screw up endlessly, and the company would keep stumbling on and stumbling on. So I figured I had, in video game parlance, I had a few lives to blow through before I had to be exactly right about it. So I decided I was going to start a company. I was going to build around Snort. And taking stock of Snort was really important at this time. We kind of had to know what I had my hands around back then. Snort was about 40,000 lines of code. We have over 5,000 subscribers on the Snort user mailing list at that point. And we're getting about 10,000 downloads a week off snort.org. And then this bottom point here is actually one of the critical data points that got me to say, you know what, I'll figure out this business model. I'm going to do this, and we'll see what works. There was a survey from a large educational institute that does IT training that showed that they basically asked people, which IDS are you using? This is before IPS came out. 92% of the respondents said we were using Snort. Maybe they're using Snort in something else. In a lot of cases, they were using Snort in something else, but 92% of the time, Snort was in there. Well, this was big, right? 92% of the places that were doing intrusion detection were using Snort, or at least that were sending their people out for training. That was big, because that gave me confidence that, you know what, there's a bunch of people out there who have a problem that needs to be solved, because I knew the problems with Snort. So we're going to build an open source product company. And we're going to figure out how to get people to pay. So why are people going to pay for open source? What are you going to do to get them to pay? Well, I thought basically, how about the aspirin model? We'll take away their pain. Because there's all sorts of pain associated with doing something like running Snort, or any security tools in a lot of cases, right? If you think about your firewalls, your intrusion detection systems, your vulnerability management systems, NetFlow, anything like that, what are the main problems that you run into from a user standpoint? It's not getting the technology to work. If you bought it, it probably works, well enough at the fundamental sensing level, at the fundamental doing its thing level. The thing that's really hard to get right is scalability and manageability. And nobody was getting that right in the open source world. We built a really effective, powerful intrusion detection sensor in Snort. Everybody was using it. It was doing a good job. We had constant development. We had constant feedback from the community. It was a very popular project. But the things that nobody was solving, people were kind of trying to figure out a way to solve it, was things like scalability. How do I take, I've got one Snort sensor, and now I want to turn it into 100 Snort sensors at my enterprise and be able to bring all that data back and manage all that policy and things like that. How am I going to do that? Well, you're not going to do that screwing around with MySQL and PHP. That's a hard problem. That's, capital H, capital P, hard problem. Something that's going to take some engineering time to solve. Manageability is a big deal too, because there are lots of buttons and dials and scales and things like that to tweak on a system like Snort, right? I want to have reporting. I want to have policy management. I want to have health monitoring. I want to have performance monitoring. I want all these things that don't really have anything to do with Snort, in the actual intrusion detection problem of getting that problem done, but need to be solved, and I need to solve them at scale. And I also wanted to make things easy to install and support. Now, back in 2000, 2001, going into the intrusion detection game, it seemed like it was a pretty stupid idea, because there was an established market out there and a lot of people had been doing it, and acquisitions had already been made in the space and things like that. But none of the solutions that were out there were really very good. They kind of did the intrusion detection thing, but even the biggest vendors that were out there hadn't figured out the scalability and manageability thing very well. Scaling the amount of data that they could accept, ease of install, ease of use, even good support. In a lot of cases, it was easy to find people who were disgruntled with the level of support that they were getting from their vendors, and these were major vendors. So I decided, look, I'm going to establish a company, and this model is going to be value add around open source. So I went out and I started kind of querying my advisors and getting kind of second and third level advisors in to kind of vet my idea. And their reaction was pretty much this. Dumb idea, kid. This will never work. Why will it never work? Well, the two reasons that usually came up were these two. People only use Snort because it's free. They don't use it because it's good. Okay. We can argue about that, but okay. And then the other thing that came out was nobody's ever been successful with a value-added product model with open source before. Therefore, it cannot be done, right? If nobody's done it before, you can't possibly do it. And oh, by the way, the only reason your core technology is popular is because it's free, not because it's good. Now, there are a lot of people out there who have varying opinions on whether or not a business model like this is good or effective or can be good and effective. But the thing that I notice with most people is that they seem to have a pretty poor understanding of kind of the core value I was trying to get at, and I think they really misunderstood how popular Snort was. Now, I didn't, and quite frankly, I still don't know why Snort is as popular as it is. I mean, it's got a lot of cool things and bells and whistles, and it's a fun community to interact with. It was especially back then. But it's complex technology, and it throws a lot of raw data at you that you have to be a fairly sophisticated person to really understand. So, I had my doubts on the one hand, but on the other hand, I thought I knew better. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to go for it. Because I don't think these people understand what they're talking about. I thought I knew better. And one of the great things about being an entrepreneur is I had an investor once tell me that a great entrepreneur was a person with an overdeveloped sense of optimism and an underdeveloped sense of fear. And I think that works well. I think that works really well in the startup environment. So I went for it because I thought I knew better than these people. And yeah, sure, he's got 20 years of experience and he's VP of engineering at an internet startup that made billions of dollars and stuff like that, but I don't think he understands open source. I don't think this person knows why Snort is popular, because I can't even say why it's popular, and I don't think it's because it's free. So I incorporated the company in 2001, and the idea was simple. We're going to build snort-based intrusion detection appliances and management infrastructure because everybody else sucks. When I say everybody else sucks, I mean all my primary competitors, right? And I'm not trying to be cheeky or anything like that. I really mean it. I mean, we went out there and we acquired our primary competitor's technology, and we went to deploy it. I spent 7 hours one day getting one of my primary large router vendor competitors' device up and running. 7 hours, me, right? I like to think I know what I'm doing, and this thing was taking forever. The other major vendor's product only took 5 hours to get running. It was ridiculous. You had to go out and you had to buy all this stuff, right? You buy the sensor infrastructure, you'd buy the hardware, you'd install the software on the hardware, then you'd go get a third-party database, right? Because you want to manage all this data. You'd have to go deploy Oracle and get an army of DBAs hanging out to get all this stuff working together. And when something broke, it was, it was like this. Oh, it's the Oracle guy's fault. It's the router vendor's fault, stuff like that. There was tons of room in this market for coming out with a solution that was better, that was more transparent, that could work better, that could give people better value for their money. So I decided to go for it. So I started the company, and about a month later, I got $100,000 in angel investment from a friend of mine that I ran the company on. And it turned out I ended up running the company on that $100,000 for about 10 months. Because getting funding in 2001 was, as they say, difficult. It was probably not quite as difficult as it is right now, but it was on the same order of magnitude. Back in 2001, the VCs talk about 2001 as nuclear winter, right? And the reason that they talk about it this way is because this was right after the dot-com bubble collapse. Once the dot-coms collapsed, the VCs were, surveying a vast landscape of wreckage out there. They were spinning down companies and selling companies when they could and shutting them down and firing people left and right. It was crazy. So here's me, Marty Roesch shows up at the door. I'm like, hey, I got a great idea. I've got this open source company, and we're going to make a lot of money selling intrusion detection. And they were like, what? Are you kidding me? Right? So when I went to these places, I was driving all on, hey, I got Snort. Snort's really popular. Everybody's using it. It's a great technology. And it's me. And, it's me was important because my reputation had been increased. My profile had been increased in the industry quite a bit. Having written Snort, having built the community and things like that. But when the VCs looked at us, it was all negatives, right? Utterly inexperienced management team. I think that actually understates the case quite a bit. The team wasn't just utterly inexperienced, it was kind of tragically inexperienced. And I was, and I was the guy running the show. I didn't know, if we wrote down a list of everything I know and everything I didn't know, we could probably fill up the 320 gig hard drive on this laptop with the stuff that I didn't know, and we wouldn't need this whole piece of paper for the stuff I did know. So we didn't have a lot of experience. We didn't really know what we were doing. We were pre-revenue. We hadn't sold anything yet. That's VC speak for hadn't sold anything yet. And we were late to market in a crowded space. Cisco was there. ISS was there. Intrusion.com was there. Interisys was there. NFR was there. And there were probably a few others that I'm not remembering. Computer Associates was there and stuff like that. So there were a bunch of guys. They've been competing for quite a while, at the end of the day, the minuses outweighed the pluses, by quite a bit. So this is the usual response I got. Call us back when you make some money, kid. Now, knowing what I know now, I can't blame them. If you look at the whole VC game and you look at, how much money these guys put into companies and what the expected returns are, the chances of a return are, it's pretty amazing. So here are the odds. Okay, so 1 in 500 business plans gets funded. So you write a business plan, you've got an idea for a whizzy startup, and you're tragically inexperienced like me, and you show up at a VC's doorstep and you say, hey, I got a great plan, I want to sell dog food on the internet. And they take a look at it and they say, no way, right? We've seen 10 companies like that, you're the worst one we've seen yet, get out. 1 in 500 business plans gets funded. 1 in 1,000 founders last past the first year post-funding. I found that to be a really interesting data point. This actually comes from one of our VCs that we eventually got. 1 in 2,500 companies that shows up at the doorstep has any kind of liquidity event. So this is getting bought, getting your money back, or having an IPO. 1 in 2,500 chance of that. And then, better, 1 in 50,000 actually manages to make it to an IPO. So if anybody walking, yeah, thank you very much. I'm getting a golf clap from the back of the room. if you want to look at the odds here, the chances of you showing up at Mr. VC's door and being the guy that's going to IPO a company sometime down the road are vanishingly small. But from the entrepreneur standpoint, we always have this to look at. It's 1 in 80,089,125 to win the Powerball lottery. So, you know, from that standpoint, if you're on the entrepreneur side, doing startups is great because you've got radically better odds than the lottery of IPOing and, you know, getting all the IPO glory. I could do a whole nother presentation on how much fun that is, but we're not going to go there. So we weren't going to get any money in 2001. In fact, we were getting denied with extreme prejudice everywhere we went in 2001. So we took it to heart and decided to get to work. And we started cranking out product. We spent 6 months generating the initial Sourcefire product release. And in the fall of 2001, we released the first intrusion sensor and did our first customer ship in late September of 2001, which was, you know, interesting timing given September 11th. All of a sudden, everybody's security awareness was greatly increased and things like that. But, you know, the interesting thing about our initial sales out of Sourcefire was that, you know, we did these initial sales between late September and mid-December. Our first 4 customers were all Fortune 1000s, and 3 out of 4 of them did 6-figure deals out of the door. And not just that, not only were they buying from us and doing relatively big deals from a company that, quite frankly, was me and 3 guys in my living room, right? But they were spending significant sums of money doing this. And to give you kind of a level, okay, so a little walk down memory lane, this was Sourcefire in 2001. This is my living room in late September 2001. We had just gotten our Sourcefire shirts. That guy there is wearing his Sourcefire shirt. Oh, so is he. So everybody was styling in their new Sourcefire polos. But this was, you know, this is my house. This is the living room where Sourcefire started. That's my kitchen where we did build-outs. You can see that stack of boxes there. That stack of boxes is our first order. That's our first $100,000 order getting ready to go out the door. And yes, that is a cat sitting on top of it. And that guy right there in the chair is is the manager of my maintenance engineering team now. He's still with the company. The cat holds the deceased position. She's no longer with us, unfortunately. And this was our lab at the time. So to say we were shoestringy is overstating the case. But you know, if you're dedicated, if you're working really hard, if you've got good ideas and good technology, you can turn this into what we have today. And that's exactly what we did. You know, and it's pretty amazing. You know, you look at this fire hazard over here in the corner, and you look at this table here, that end table from Walmart that was supporting our development environment. It's pretty scary how shoestringy it was, but we got through it, and eventually, you know, we started selling. So why did people buy from a company that, quite frankly, could have been wiped out by a bad day at the Mexican restaurant? Right? So we could have gotten some bad burritos, and that would have been it. Our support would have been gone for a week or two, right? Why did people buy from us? People bought from us because of open source. They had trust in the company. And this is really fascinating. Once people knew it was me, I was doing the selling back then. So literally, they were on the phone with me, on the phone, and I was out on my deck selling to customers, selling to big customers, government contractors, financial firms, things like that. They knew it was me. The guys I was talking to were open source users. So these were guys who'd been used to interacting with me via email, via IRC for years anyway. And they were in positions of power now. They had budget, or they were a technical decision maker or whatever. They had the ability to leverage the relationship that we had established solely over the internet, and they had budget. So they're like, well, we need a new IDS solution. We've tried the majors. That hasn't worked very well. We're running Snort anyway. Why don't we go to the professional version and see if we can make it better? There was a very, very large user community out there that was the vanguard of Sourcefire's customers, and they continue to be that way. Snort users, every Snort user, from my perspective, is a potential Sourcefire customer once their pain point gets to a sufficient level, right? Once they have to start scaling it, once they need manageability, once their boss tells them, hey, I need something that's supported by a third party because, you know, we've got to demonstrate SARbox compliance or PCI compliance or whatever. Once they get to that point where they have the problem that Sourcefire solves, it's very easy and natural for a Snort user to switch over to Sourcefire because it's, you know, it's what they're used to. It's more scalable, it's more manageable, it's easy to deploy, it's supported, and it's got a really good research team behind it. So every Microsoft Tuesday, the patches come out, your systems automatically update. And we've got all sorts of other cool bells and whistles in there too. Back then, not so much. But now, yeah, that stuff's there. So once we started selling, guess who showed up? These guys, venture capitalists, are good friends. And the VC were very interested in talking to us because I'd done about $350,000 in business from out of my living room, literally, in a very short period of time. So once we had done that, you know, they saw, hey, Marty's actually kind of taking orders here right now, right? It's not like he's going out there and doing a bunch of marketing. I was doing marketing on the Snort mailing list by virtue of my signature saying, hey, you know, professional Snort devices, right? Enterprise class Snort, available at sourcefire.com. My email address was sourcefire.com, which drew people over, and I would speak at conferences. And that was kind of the entirety of our marketing back then. So we were literally, you know, the phone was ringing, or I was, you know, not the phone was ringing, I was getting emails from people, and that was turning into orders. So towards the end of 2001, I started a serious process to raise venture capital. And the reason that I did that, and the reason that many of you, if you have an open source project, would probably want to do that, was due to the market dynamics. If you look at the dynamics of, you know, the market of intrusion prevention in 2001, what you're going to see is you're going to see a bunch of big vendors out there. You're going to see Cisco. You're going to see, well, there was one Secure which got bought by Juniper eventually. You're going to see ISS and all the other guys out there. Well, I wanted to compete with Cisco, right? Because I knew there were a bunch of customers out there who weren't really thrilled with their Cisco installs. So I wanted to go get them. And if I was going to go get them, if I was going to grab that market share, I was going to need money to do it. Not a little bit of money, a lot of money, right? We run the company literally on $100,000 for 10 months. The guys wanted to have salaries. Like, we weren't even paying salaries in the beginning. We weren't paying salaries. We weren't paying for anything except for equipment to get the stuff built and get it out the door and travel once in a while. So we needed money, and we needed quite a bit of money. So I hit the road and started doing, started raising the Series A. And I raised it in two tranches, and two tranches means in two pieces. Did a $2 million raise on the first tranche and then $5.65 million on the second tranche. And flew continuously between Waltham and Palo Alto for about 3 months. And it was a very, very interesting process. You know, one of the interesting, so I was at a big cloud service provider a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to them, and we were talking about Snort and, you know, how they're using Snort internally, and kind of comparing notes on how we were getting it to scale and things like that, because these guys are very big, and they're probably not going to want Sourcefire for a while. So we were talking about it, and you know, we got talking about what kind of companies are you interested in, Marty? What are you thinking about buying? You know, are you thinking about buying companies and things like that? And I said, yeah. And they said, well, you know, how do you, when you look at these guys, how do you look at them? I said, well, usually I look at their technology first to see if it's interesting, and then I look at their balance sheet to see how they're doing. And these guys were like, you know, it was a room full of engineers. They're all kind of shocked that, Marty's looking at balance sheets. But it's important, right? I raised this entire Series A by myself and learned a lot in the process. It's very important that if you're going to do an open source company, especially if you're the guy, the main guy who's running the company, who founded the company and things like that, you're going to have to be very hands-on in the early stages. So I went out there, I talked to a total of, I think, 24 different VC organizations. At the end of the day, I got 4 term sheets, which is, hey, we're interested in funding you. Here are our terms. We're going to use Vaseline. We're not going to use Vaseline. We're going to use sand and broken glass, whatever. If you understand the investing process, you know what I'm talking about. And I decided to go with Sierra Ventures as my Series A lead. And at the end of the day, you ask the question, okay, so why'd they fund you? You're an open source core technology with this value add model that was really unproven back then. Why did they fund us? Well, they funded us because we were making money when I was the only guy selling. And if I can sell this stuff, imagine what could happen if you got guys who actually knew what they were doing selling this stuff, right? Because we were targeting a very specific market. We wanted to sell to the enterprise market. The enterprise market, I figured, was our sweet spot, because these were the people who were going to have a need for a lot of snort sensors, right? They had the scale problem that we were going to get into. They also had a lot of money, right? So you want to go find a market that's got the problem that you're trying to solve and that has a lot of money. And for us, that was the enterprise. And we were able to sell to these guys with just me doing the selling. So it didn't matter that I didn't know how to do a pipeline, that I didn't know how to do a forecast. I had an embarrassing moment at a VC once where I didn't know the difference between bookings and revenues, right? So there was a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't know back then. But despite that, we were making money. And the open source thing was actually hugely valuable. Once again, And the reason that it was valuable was because it established reputation. So as you know, in the security world, reputation is everything. Like your reputation as an individual, the reputation of the technologies that you work with, even the reputation of the technologies that you choose to work with is everything. And in an open source project, it's exactly the same way. You know, they talk about the gift economy with open source. If you read the Cathedral and the Bazaar, they'll talk about, you know, kind of the open source principles of release early, release often, and communication, and also this idea of the gift economy. The idea of the gift economy is that your reputation is tied directly to the level of contribution that you have to the community. So I had a high reputation in my community, which, you know, started out as a snort community and later kind of bled over into the security industry because of the work that I had done with open source, right? So because I built quality technology, I had a good reputation. Because I interacted with people on a level that was, you know, of equals essentially, because I wasn't a dick, as I said at the beginning of this thing, people had high regard for me, and that made getting money easier. Because anytime one of these VCs would go out and do reference checks, they'd call up, you know, they'd call up technical guys that they'd been working with for a long time, and they'd say, do you know anything about Snort? Do you know anything about Roesch? And 9 times out of 10, it would come back, don't know a whole lot about Roesch, but I know he has a really good reputation, and, you know, I'm not an intrusion detection guy, but I know Snort is everywhere. And that's all it took. It was huge, absolutely huge. Most startups don't have this advantage. If you're just a startup, so if you show up like me, but you don't have, you know, you're doing proprietary Snort instead of open source Snort, you show up at these guys' doors, and nobody knows who you are because you don't have the reputation that's been established by your open source community, and nobody knows anything about your technology. Guess what the chances are that you're going to be that 1 in 500 that gets funded? 0, right? Nothing. You're not going to get squat because nobody knows you. You're going to have to not only have radically reduced chance of getting money, but the amount of time it's going to take to get money is going to be radically increased because you're going to be spending your time establishing your reputation with the VCs, and the way that you're going to do that is you're going to hang out with them. Lots. You're going to go in there for lots and lots and lots of meetings. And that happened to me. They string you along for a while. They're trying to figure out, you know, who you are and what you're doing, and they bring in one partner or another partner and things like that. Well, until you get to the full partner meeting, you haven't really met with the VCs yet. You've just met with their associates and things like that. And that's when you get to the partner meetings when they're making a decision about whether or not they're going to fund you. Everything leading up to that is quite frankly making them feel good about taking you to the partner meeting. So, you know, Series A of Sourcefire, I had to do a bunch of that. Once we got funded, Series B, C, and D, we didn't have to do that anymore. Our reputation was established as a company at that point, and people saw that Sourcefire could make money. So this open source thing is absolutely huge for establishing reputation and for getting people comfortable with your company. The difference between having it and not having it is night and day. Can you imagine how difficult it would be to do Sourcefire in 2001 if we hadn't had open source? Think about it. So I'm going into a crowded market space. I'm yet another proprietary solution, got an incredibly inexperienced team, and a technology that is, you know, roughly on par with all the other technologies that are out there. It doesn't really have much differentiation, at least not that anybody can see. With Snort, everybody knew who we were. Everybody knew the differentiation of the technology. It's open, it's transparent, you can modify it, you can extend it. Everybody had all of that already kind of established. And once that was in place, then it was just convincing these guys that, you know, giving me a few $1 million wasn't the worst bet that they ever made in their life. So once we got open source, it was kind of off to the races. These are results. These are our revenue figures for the last, well, since I started the company. So from about $300,000 the first year I was in business up to about $76 million last year. So that's not too shabby. There's some, if you curve the, or graph out the curve here, it flattens in some places and spikes in some others based on kind of externalities that are happening. Like we had a failed acquisition that by Checkpoint back in 2006 that effectively got the federal government to stop buying our stuff for almost 2 years, things like that. And then last year you see it kicked back in. You can see the bar gets a little taller, a little faster there. Other results are things like this. We were one of the 1 in 50,000 to actually get there and do an IPO. Now you'll notice I'm fast forwarding a bit, right? I went from, okay, and this is how we got our VC funding, and voila, IPO. But you know, from an open source standpoint of understanding how this stuff works, there is a lot of stuff that happened between now and then. From incorporating the company to first customer ship of our first product, to our first round of VC, to staffing up, shipping new alternate technologies, all of these things that had to happen and had to happen well. But most of that stuff is business execution. If you think you're going to win the hearts and minds of everybody with superior technology, especially selling in the enterprise space, think again. You need solid sales execution, you need solid marketing execution, you need a solid management team. One of the things we did early on in the company was we really overhired management. We hired a bunch of guys who were qualified to run public companies back when Sourcefire was 40 people. And the reason that we did that was that many of those people are still with the company. In fact, the majority of those people are still with the company. We still have our core management team, even today, that we had in 2002. And that's meaningful, because you don't have people who are ramping up, who are coming up to speed on what the technology does and how it works and things like that. It really means a lot. And there's been all sorts of challenges along the way. We had Gartner declare our core technology, declared intrusion detection dead in 2003, so we had to invent a whole other technology to stay relevant. We had a failed acquisition in 2005, 2006, which cost us a lot of momentum in the government. We had an IPO, which quite frankly was not a high point of the company in some ways. If you know what Sourcefire's history has been like as a public company, it's been rocky because we had some execution issues in 2007. And, these things happen. But at the end of the day, despite the fact that my stock price is wherever it is today, 650 or something like that, people ask, would you do it again, knowing that, your stock price was going to be a third of what it was shortly after you IPO'd and things like that? The answer is yeah. There's a lot more strategy to doing IPOs than just, getting the big cash out and walking off into the sunset and being rich and buying Lamborghinis and stuff like that. There's way more to it than that. The things that are there when you IPO, especially if you're not getting bought, it's just getting more money into the company and giving your stock a real value that can be sold on the street. And let me tell you, as the founder of the company, you're kind of like the captain of the ship. If you want to sell your stock, you're the last man off the boat. You don't get to really sell a whole bunch of stock, right? You don't get to buy the Lamborghini and get rich. You can leverage against that if you want to. Anybody can be happy to let you leverage up your stock, but in these current market conditions, that's probably not such a good idea. But a lot of stuff did happen. But most of the stuff that's related to open source was early on. All the ideology was cemented in the first year that the company was running. All the operations around the open source model were solidified in the first 18 months of the company. And the open source effect is absolutely huge. It's amazing how impactful open source was for Sourcefire. What did open source do for Sourcefire? A lot of people talk about, we've put technologies into Snort, some of which are pretty innovative. We got, back in 2002, we got Snort running at gigabit speeds. More recently, we're running at 10 gigabit speeds. We put in new types of detection in there. We put in systems that will allow the sensors to tune themselves and things like that. We're actually continuing to move the ball forward on the technology itself, on the core fundamental technology of how good an IPS can be, how effective you can be by deploying IPS. We've done those things, and what that's done for us is continue to maintain our community and move it forward. Because what that community does for us is this: it gives us trust. People trust us because we keep moving the technology forward, because we've always been a good citizen to them. We've never done things that have hurt our users, and we've always tried to move the ball forward. And not only that, but we keep trying to innovate. We come up with new ideas on how to solve the problem, and then we implement them in technology, and we give it away. And why do we do that? Because that builds our addressable community, right? I look at the open source community as kind of like this universe of people. I'm into astronomy. I don't know how many people know that, but I do astronomy as my hobby, and one of the underlying themes of cosmology, of understanding how the universe works, is this concept of inflation, of the universe getting bigger all the time as a result of the Big Bang. But it's not the universe that's getting bigger. It's not more mass is being created. It's space itself is inflating. So it's like the surface of a balloon. It's stretching effectively. Well, the open source community is kind of like the universe in that regard. If I have 5% of the open source market, the way that I continue to grow my user share is not by trying to seize more percentage of the open source market, it's by increasing the number of users that I got. So if I have a constant 5% of the user base out there using my stuff, and I want to add people to the mix, I increase my open source market. That's very important. And It allows us to maintain the effects that open source gives us of trust. People trust us walking in the door. They know who we are and what we're about. It gives us credibility. People took me seriously. Fortune 1000 companies took me seriously selling in shorts and a t-shirt, barefoot, on the deck of my house in 2001 because they knew who I was, they knew that I was capable of creating good technology, and they knew that I wasn't going to quit. I wasn't just going to disappear like some fly-by-night operation. I was going to be there. I had credibility, regardless of what my company looked like. You saw what the pictures were there, right? Regardless of what the company looked like, I had credibility, and therefore the company had credibility, and the technology had credibility. We had credibility wrapped all around us as a result of doing this open source project. We had access too. Access is absolutely huge. How many companies do you get pinging on your door all the time saying, hey, would you let me come in and do a demo? Would you let me talk to you? You know, I want to show you my whiz-bang widget and things like that. It happens to me all the time. I get, you know, an absolute massive pile of email every day from people who want to show me something, who want to demo something, who just want 5 minutes of my time and things like that. If you're a startup and nobody knows who you are, you're on that treadmill. When I would send an email and say, hey, I'm going to be in town, or I would just send an email out to the Snort mailing list. I'm going to be in San Francisco next week, and I'm speaking at this conference. I'm going to be hanging out there for 3 days. I get emails back. Hey, you want to meet? You know, hey, we're doing an IDS project. You want to come over and we can talk about it and stuff like that? Or, you know, it even works now where, you know, my sales guys will say, hey, Marty, they won't meet with me, but they will meet with you. So could you come? It gives you respect too. So one of the, you know, and this is, okay, so this is a weird phenomenon of the open source and something I'm not entirely comfortable with, and really I've been debating about whether I should talk about it at all. So, and the reason is, I'll goes back to that pretentious slide. I don't want to come off like a pretentious jerk, but that said, let's talk about me. I think one of the really interesting things and one of the effects of open source, and maybe it's my particular reputation or the reputation of the technology, I'm not sure how this came to be, but there's a big difference between being a big vendor, being Cisco and walking in a room and trying to win a deal, or some startup walking in a room and trying to win a deal away from Cisco, and walking in a room to try to get a deal away from Cisco or some other vendor, and you know, before the meeting opens up, you get 5 guys from the buyer, 5 people at the company who are thinking about buying your stuff, asking you for autographs. I get that. I don't know why. My wife thinks it's really weird, but I get that. And do you have any idea how meaningful that is? Do you have any idea how huge that is? This dark matter thing down here at the bottom is, you know, back to the universal theme I was talking about a few minutes ago. Open source gives your company mass, more mass than it actually has. So one of the big problems they've got in the universe is that you know, gravity doesn't quite work right on large scales, and they've come up with things like dark matter and dark energy to explain it. So the universe has this kind of hidden mass that holds everything together, and they're not quite sure what it is or how it works. Open source is kind of that way too. Open source gave Sourcefire mass. Back when Sourcefire was nothing, back when, you know, a car crash going to lunch could have literally wiped out the whole company, we had mass. People treated us as they treated a lot of these other companies. And yeah, they thought, you know, in the final analysis, when you started looking at the numbers and things like that, the financial guys would say, hey, wait a second, these guys, you know, these guys barely exist at all. Why are you thinking of spending this much money with them? Well, you know, as far as the people who were doing the buying, the technical decision makers were concerned, we were on an equal footing with all the biggest vendors out there, even when we were 30, 40, 100 people. So open source gives you that too, because open source establishes your name, it establishes your presence, it gives you credibility in a room full of people that you wouldn't have otherwise. Okay, so open source theories. So we'll come into the home stretch here. So these are my pet open source theories that I've kind of developed over the past few years of working at Sourcefire and developing Snort and things like that. This top one is probably one of the most important ones, and this talks about the business value of an open source project. I believe that the business value of an open source project is related directly not to the technology itself, but to the size of the project in terms of the community. How big is the community? How vibrant is the community? How frequently do releases come out? You know, how big is this thing? So Snort has at least several 100,000 users. We have a hard time getting real metrics around Snort in a lot of ways. We have a few 100,000 people registered on snort.org, and we know how many downloads we get and how many people download rules updates on Microsoft Tuesday and things like that. It's at least in the hundreds of thousands, maybe in the low millions of users of Snort. We acquired the ClamAV technology at the end of 2007. The ClamAV technology gets 1 million unique IP addresses a day updating the signature database. 1 million a day. It's a much bigger project than Snort. So we acquired it. Why did we do that? We haven't monetized it yet, but we acquired it. Why did we do that? Because it's got a large open source community. And what are these guys? Well, if I can figure out a way to monetize 1% or 5% of them, I can figure out how to solve the pain for 1, 5, 10% of them, that's going to be a significant amount of money coming into Sourcefire. And I'm not going to go into the reasons why we haven't monetized it yet, but, but we are continuing to work on it. So open source projects, and this is actually fairly rare. If you look at like SourceForge, SourceForge is the graveyard of 1,000 Perl scripts, right? It's, there's all this stuff out there that's just out there, neglected, wasted. I saw something not too long ago that the median number of developers listed in a SourceForge project is 1, and the vast majority of them are abandoned. It's really interesting. Getting critical mass in an open source project is actually pretty tough. And like I said, I can't explain why Snort took off the way it did, other than I was having fun putting out releases and interacting with people. It was fun for me. So, the first 2 years of Snort development were all in my spare time and just me having fun and doing stuff that I thought was neat. But building this community up, that has value, because once you've got that community in place, you can think about monetizing some percentage of it, because they're going to have a problem that you can solve. So open source users are your farm team. I talked about this inflationary idea. Growing the size of the community grows the size of your addressable base. Whether or not that as a percentage, it stays constant. That's a really big deal too. So what does this mean practically? It means you can't close your open source project. If you've got an open source technology and it's popular and it's well known and it's out there and it's doing things like opening doors and gaining credibility for you, building trust, things like that, it's absolutely critical that you keep it open. Because as soon as you close that technology, you've done 2 things. If you're not the leader in the space, you've done 2 things. And chances are you're not. If you're coming from an open source position, you're not. Number 1 is you've pissed off your community, right? So all these people who are your buddies are no longer your buddies because they're mad that you took away their toy. You took your ball and you went home. Well, that's great. Well, they're all going to go see if they can find another ball, make another ball, something like that. And then the other problem that happens when you do this is that you just went from being an open source vendor with kind of the open source cachet and this open source community who was interested in some regard to your technology. You not only just did that, you not only just got rid of that community, but you also just turned yourself into a tiny proprietary vendor that does this one thing. And yeah, it's got a good name for itself, but the people who used to like you, who would open the door, they're not there anymore. So once you've committed to open sourcing a project, I think you really got to stick at it. And and this is an educational process both inside and outside your companies. Some places you'll show up, and I've gotten it before, you show up at the door, and you say, hey, I'm the Snort guy, and I want to sell you my Snort solution and stuff like that. And they'll say, oh, you can't trust open source because it's less secure than proprietary systems. I read it in Microsoft Systems Journal or something. You get that. You get that pushback from the customers once in a while, and that's happening a lot less now. The other pushback that you get is from non-technologists within your company, and this is an educational process. When we hired on our star management team at Sourcefire, as they came on board, or as I interviewed them, it was, the line was always, this stuff's going to be open source, and if you can't deal with the whole open source concept, the whole open source model, you need to think about whether you want to really be here, because we're not going to close source this technology. It's going to be open from now on, and that's it. And every improvement that we make is going to go back out there in this technology. So people, you had to get your management signed up for it as well. Otherwise, you're going to be facing this constant, relentless pressure from the people who don't get how open source work, who don't get what the value of the open source technology is, pressuring you to close it down. And then the last point about the open source technology is that it's absolutely critical if you're going to start a company, product company, around an open source technology, that you own the technology. You've got to be me or the guys at ClamAV or whoever that start the company. It can't be some third party trying to monetize it, because I guarantee you, as soon as the person who's actually doing all the work sees that you're making a lot of money and not giving any to them, they're probably either going to become hostile and start changing things that break your system, or they're going to go start their own company, and all of a sudden you're going to be competing from a real disadvantage, right? Because at Sourcefire, what can we control with Snort? I control everything. I control when it gets released. I control the features. I control the rule language. I control the configuration file formats. I control the output formats. I control all of this stuff. So if you're trying to interpret snort output and I'm changing the output formats every release, I'm giving you a lot of work to do. You're always going to be behind me in that game. If I change the snort rules language, you're always going to be behind me and getting your stuff updated to be able to work with it. If I put new features in there, you're going to be behind the curve on integrating them into your technology, because especially if they're big new features, like our systems that we're doing self-tuning with and things like that now, you're not going to have the infrastructure to do that at all. You're going to be at a radical disadvantage from the person who owns that technology. So you've got to own the technology. If you really want to be successful with it, and it's something that you can get your hands around like a snort or a clam AV, you really need to own that technology. Otherwise, you're going to have a significant hurdle placed in front of you from the get-go that's always going to be there. Because let me tell you, if you try to IPO a company and you don't own the core IP, you got a problem. You're going to show up on Wall Street, you're going to go to Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs or whatever, and they're going to say, okay, well, tell you what, how about no? You guys are a services company, or whatever. What would happen, Peter? I mean, this came up when we were doing Sourcefire's IPO. Who owns the code? How much of the code do you own? Have there been any contributions? When are you going to clean it up? All that stuff. That came up. Peter was an analyst at Morgan Stanley when Sourcefire went public, so he had front row seats. Now he sits in the back, that's right. That's okay. So that's pretty much it. So if you pull all the stuff together and do it right, you can be an achiever just like me. so that's how to make mad loot with open source. So are there any questions out there? Yep.
So you mentioned that when you're taking your management team on board, the principle that we're going to stay open source is very important to you. And there, you kind of had the upper hand in saying, look, this is how it's going to be. I'm just wondering with the VCs, do you think that was an issue when you're dealing with them? And did it end up influencing which terms you signed, their kind of ability to get that, either agree or not?
Okay, so the question basically is, did this whole open source thing influence what kind of term sheets you got, what quality of term sheets you got from third parties? The VCs didn't seem to have a real problem with it. Red Hat was out there, so they understood basically open source to some level, and open source even then had kind of a cachet with it. The big problem, especially in 2001, was companies like VA Linux just completely blew up, and really Red Hat stocks took a big hit during the dot-com bubble burst, as I recall. So one of the things that they said in 2001 was, hey kid, look at all the open source companies that are smoking wreckage right now. You sure you want to do that? And open source is dead. Call me back when you make some money. That was a problem initially, but the interesting thing is that if you can get one of the VC partners on your side, kind of explain the logic of what you're doing and why it's going to work and how it's going to work and things like that, you can make the case. And really, I'm a sales guy to some extent, but I'm a very logical kind of person, so I tend to state things in those terms. If you can, and a lot of VCs are engineers. They're former engineers, or they're guys with technical backgrounds. So if you can make that case to them and make the logical argument, they'll take it and they'll think about it for a while. And so I don't think it influenced our term sheets tremendously. I think the things that were much more influential on our early term sheets were the experience and the revenue lumpiness and lack of revenue and stuff like that. That was much more influential to them, because all those guys, they want to hear about your technology first, and then as soon as they decide whether or not it has any merit at all, then it's all financials, financials, financials. How are you going to sell this stuff? I can't tell you how many meetings I sat through during the Series A process where we talked about sales. And I'm not a sales manager by any stretch of the imagination. And I remember one meeting when they were talking about, so you're going to be direct sales, or you're going to be channel sales. And I said, well, I think we're going to start off direct and then get into channels as we mature. And they said, do you have any idea how hard it is to set up a channel? Setting up channels is, it's like climbing Mount Everest or something like that. And I said, I looked at the guys, I was like, well, Microsoft did it, right? Symantec did it. All these big companies did it, so it's a problem that's solvable, isn't it? I mean, this isn't utterly impossible. It can be solved. It's just a matter of getting the pieces together, isn't it? They're all like, yeah, but it's really, really hard. And chances of you getting it right, they're thinking about the Powerball lottery, right? Chances of you getting it right are pretty slim, and they were right. Chances of me getting it right are very slim. But if I hired in the right guy, who I didn't have at that time, they get much better. Yep. Sure.
the final version.
Yep.
Would that make it a lot less attractive to VCs? Because from what I understand, your team wrote the code. What if you open it up to everyone?
Okay, so there's a few things there. So, so the question is, if I take third-party contributions with automatic assignment of rights of those contributions, does that make it less attractive to VCs? Actually, that'll probably make it more attractive to VCs because they want to have the IP bundled up in one entity as much as possible. Because when you have that, you can sell it, you can OEM it, you can do whatever you want with it, right? You can sell it to somebody else, you can license it out. If you have all this open source entanglement with a bunch of third parties that have contributed code that you don't own, that you don't have copyrights to, and there's all sorts of legal hairballs out there that are around this. If you can get it all yours, you should get it all yours. And in fact, with recent versions of Snort, we've got riders in the Snort licenses that basically clarify what our interpretation of the GPL v2 is. And quite frankly, GPL v2 is open to interpretation. So if you look at like Nmap or Snort, we basically say, hey, look, if you want to contribute to this project, cool. Anything that you contribute belongs to us. We consider those to be gifts, and they're assigned to Sourcefire. If you have a larger module of code that you want to contribute to the system, send us an email and we'll talk. But we want as little third-party ownership of our core open source code base as possible because that really limits us, constrains us from maximizing what we can do with that code base. So VCs will be much more favorable if you have everything tied up in a nice legal bow with your open source technology. Open source users might be a little less inclined to contribute to it on the one hand, but on the other hand, you know what? At the end of the day, most of those guys want free stuff that works well, and if they can get their feature into it, they're pretty happy about that. There's a lot of pragmatists out there. For all the revolutionaries out there who are who have the proper revolutionary spirit, there's 100 people who just want to get work done, and most people can live with that. And I know I'm saying this right down the road from MIT. I'm sure Stallman's going to storm in the room any minute now and club me to death. But I think there's a lot of room for compromise with open source projects. All open source. Okay, so the question is Snort a read-only open source project? All open source projects are read-only. You have the code, so if you want to make local changes and distribute them yourself, you're free to. But if you want to get something into the code tree, it's not a democracy. This is a common misconception with open source projects that we get from our competitors all the time. They say, oh, any jackass can contribute to Snort, and it can be doing who knows what, backdoors and all sorts of stuff, and crashes and buffer overflows and all this other crap. Open source projects, a well-run open source project is a benevolent dictatorship. There's one guy at the top of the pyramid who says what gets in and what does not. So they're all read-only because you have to get that guy to say, okay, I'll put that into the code base, or it's not in the code base. So the difference here is that I'm accepting your code, and I don't want to have the legal encumbrance of looking out for your copyrights and your interpretation of the GPL and things like that. Because quite frankly, from a business standpoint, that gets real hairy in a big hurry. Do you have a question, Adam?
Yeah. How would you, if you had the rank order, like what were the features you needed to build on top or to make it a real product to the person? Was it? I'm not asking this for the reason,
Sure. Right.
But like, is the management interface with the scalability? Like, what was the most monetizable feature?
Okay. So the question is, what was the most monetizable feature or features that I built on top of Snort starting the company? The things that I identified early on, it's pretty easy. If it takes me 7 hours to install one of my competitors' products, ease of installation. Put it on an appliance, make it so you can turn it on and get it up and running in about 15 minutes. So ease of installation, and really, data management and data analytics. This is a dirty secret of the intrusion detection industry, is that everybody's all about detection, nobody wants to talk about data. Well, all these things do is generate data all day, every day. How are you going to manage it? If you deploy $1 million worth of vendor X's gear, and then you call them back and say, hey, I want to manage all the data now, and they say, call Oracle, they make a really nice database. You should be pissed off, because they only solved half the problem for you. So data management for us was a big thing. So put a GUI on it that allows me to work with lots of data, put a database right in the system that's going to scale with the amount of data that I can expect in most of my deployments, that sort of thing.
So the interesting thing you really bring up is the installation times. Like, were competitors shipping out like pre-install boxes for demo, and then you go and buy the product and it takes 6 hours to get it running, or is it?
Well, the 7-hour case that I'm identifying was actually an appliance, believe it or not. And the 5-hour case was a piece of software that ran on top of Windows. Yeah, so one you had to install, and there was all sorts of key management stuff. And the appliance had 3 GUIs. It had a Windows Fat client, had a web GUI, and it had a Java GUI. I mean, it had 3 GUIs for the thing. And then the stack of documents that it came with was this thick, and half of it was talking about routers. So I mean, there was no intuitive way to get into the product at all. It was almost built as if it had been built to maximize consulting hours, effectively. Any more questions out there? We're pretty much at my time limit, so I should probably wrap up. Well, I'd just like to thank everybody for coming and spending some time with me today. If anybody has any questions or follow-up, I'm going to be here through tomorrow, so feel free to catch up with me, and I'd love to chat about this stuff. Thanks very much.